Okay. I want to just do a short video to say a few positive things about the evangelical church. And what even do I mean when I'm saying that? And I'm sure I'm not going to define it as precisely as it could be. So just broad brush strokes here. Under the general umbrella, larger category of Protestantism, as distinct from Catholicism, right? And you know what? I'm glad I'm saying this because it just reveals my own ignorance. I'm not sure how much more specific what is in there and what is not. Okay, again, so this will be my definition of it. Less formal, less liturgical structure. Not that there's not a structure to the services, but it's not, at a minimum, we could say not as traditional. And I think it'd be safe to say in general, just less of an overall kind of ritual-based structure. Non-denominational churches, the way I think this is not an uncontroversial thing to say, would be considered evangelical. It's a strong emphasis on, and this is Protestantism writ large, is that the right expression? This is of a piece with Protestantism, within that general. This isn't just what I'm describing here as the evangelical church, but anything under that category of Protestantism. Big focus on the Bible, on Scripture. This is a fool's errand undertaken by a fool, because I just don't have enough. I've got a lot of experiential knowledge, but because Catholics also obviously love the Bible, but it's a different. Protestant Bible has a few less books in it, I believe. What else have I noticed that's really characteristic? At least the way I'm defining it, it's definitely more of a contemporary experience. Often live bands, kind of like a rock concert type of environment. I've said in other videos. But worship music versus, singing hymns with an organ or something like that out of a hymnal. Or maybe there's evangelical churches that would, in the more accurate definition, that would be that way as well. But seems to be a very American phenomenon. I guess maybe the reason why that evangelical label, what's common across all that, is there's a huge emphasis on evangelizing. But that's also kind of all Christianity, but it's a different flavor here. There's a huge emphasis on being saved, being born again, profession of faith, through saying like a sinner's prayer or something like that. A lot of the evangelical services will include a call to new people to give their life to Jesus in a way that would be out of place or seem strange in a Catholic church service during Mass or something like that. Not that they don't evangelize, but it's a different approach. It's a kind of place that would, though it's a church and you're doing religion in a sense, you will often hear people say, "Oh, I'm here, but this is not religion. I'm not here for religion. I'm here for a relationship with Jesus." And that's good, man. The whole point I wanted to make with this video, because I feel like I've been kind of critical on other things, I want to say some positive things in the direction of evangelical Christianity. And some of the critiques that or things that have kind of struck me well, first, just kind of personally don't fit too well with me. Some of the extroversion of the church, some of the performative elements of it, just kind of personally, how I am, personality-wise, don't fit too well. And also just kind of this unmooring from certain elements of tradition. There's things around beauty, and Protestantism in general has, I think, kind of famously, I don't know, speaking a little bit past my knowledge set here, but I think it's true to say that Protestantism in general has placed less value on beauty and aesthetics, Catholic cathedral versus many kind of, there's nice Protestant and evangelical spaces as well, but there's less formality. I think that works for a lot of people, so that's a strength and a weakness. That, for example, kind of superficial, but the preacher, the priest, the pastor often is just wearing regular clothes. Not to say inappropriate clothes. Well, maybe. Depends on your perspective. But, button-down shirt, jeans, t-shirt, jeans, or khakis or whatever. It's kind of business casual. Or maybe even less sometimes, I don't know. But it's not like a frock. It's not like traditional garments. And the space itself, another thing about Protestantism in general, there's a lot less, it's kind of iconoclastic, and I'm guessing that has to do with the history of, Luther's approach and different things that they were repudiating and not wanting to get wrapped up in idols and things like that. So there's a kind of ideological purity that kind of has cut away a lot of sort of the dressings or material aspects, material artifacts of the religion that you would find in especially in Orthodox, Greek or Russian or something like that church, but in Catholic churches as well. You really don't see like Christ on a cross in most Protestant and evangelical spaces, things like that. So here I am offering more critiques. These are things that I don't really like as much. I think beauty is great. I think it's a foretaste of heaven, of higher realms. They're just going to be soaked, saturated in visible, tangible, actual physical beauty. Spiritual. It's like it's the spiritual essence expressed in these anyways. But I have noticed in interactions, there's a boldness with evangelicalism. The evangelical church and having been on the circuit exploring things, it's the Wild West. It is totally the Wild West of Christianity. So maybe this is more of a pros and cons, because a lot of this I can see both ways. Negative side, it can lead to that unmooring from kind of a more traditional structure, that kind of freewheeling aspect that you get with, these non-denominational churches in a way. They're sort of almost like, in business, the analog would be a startup company, right? It's like they're starting up, they've got this zealous core of people probably, and they've got an idea for a church, and sometimes it sprouts and it grows, and versus, a well-established business. That's a pretty, I don't really like comparing something sacred to the business world, but until I think of a better analogy, it's something like that. But it's the Wild West in the evangelical and non-denominational church in some ways. What's, I could say, not so good about that is you can fall prey to personality cults, because so much, you can have a charismatic figure that holds the church together. You see, with a Catholic hierarchy, Catholic structure, you have this whole kind of you have this whole structure that it transcends the local. The local are not fully in command of their destiny. No, they're part of this larger structure, and there's positive and negatives on that side as well. But there's a stability there and a kind of protection, I think, against personality cults, against megalomania, against an individual church kind of in isolation going off in really idiosyncratic ways that are unhealthy, becoming cult-like, etc. So that could be a negative. On the positive, though, there's real opportunity for boldness and innovation, and it can be, I think, probably less intimidating for some people to go to some of these non-denominational churches and evangelical churches, because it doesn't require a huge entry cost. You don't have to know all the rituals, and you kind of show up, you enjoy some music, you listen to the pastor give a sermon. If there's communion, sometimes there's not, and you just see what seems to be more just like ordinary people that look like you doing it. There's less of a formality. It feels less like what some people associate with religion in a negative context. I don't think that really is negative. I don't think it has to be negative for sure. And especially as I've gotten older, I really appreciate the formality and the ritual, but in some sense, that lack of being tied to a larger structure means there's greater responsiveness, greater flexibility, greater that they're able to meet people. They're more accessible in some ways, and I've experienced that because for a while I was really trying to do some spiritual deliverance work for myself. And that's kind of a crazy thing. That's a really wild thing. And to do that and to get access to, pastor or church leadership or something like that, it's way easier. And just in general, the sense I got and the experience of it was, it's much easier to contact and have direct interactions with, church leadership in these non-denominational, and I'm hesitating to use this word, but in the Catholic Church, it's more of I don't want to say bureaucracy, because that's really kind of a very profane word. But there is this structure, again, positive and negatives here, but one downside to that is when you're really struggling, when you're really desperate, and if you're not already a Catholic, that process takes quite a long time, months, sometimes a year or more, I don't know, months I think at least. There's a whole, and it's good that they have requirements and standards and things that they want somebody to commit to get into their church, but that really isn't how it was for Jesus. People who didn't believe, who didn't even know who he was, but saw something there, rushed to him, and he helped them and he delivered them, and he was responsive then and there. Now, I can also imagine there was a crush of people, and he at some point probably wasn't as accessible. And I don't think it's really something evil or insidious or bad, definitely not evil, but insidious or bad or about the Catholic Church. I think it's just kind of a trade-off, and it's a function of having that hierarchy and that structure. I had this image in my mind that these non-denominational churches are sort of like speedboats. They're these agile, nimble, quick, they can turn on a dime and go out and meet people who are drowning in the ocean, right? And they can go out to them and be responsive to them in that way. And the Catholic Church is more like this giant freighter, and it kind of just waits for the drowning people to try to make their way over to the church, or The idea of trying to turn the ship to go out in that way just doesn't seem to be built that way. That's not a perfect analogy. Hold that one loosely, but it's pointing in the direction. It's something like that. And that's really good for somebody who just is burning for transformation, burning to get connected to a church. You can walk in on any given day to a lot of these churches and just have that radical transformation. And there's a huge emphasis on that in these churches. And there's a boldness, these street preachers and things like that. There's things that I really dislike about that, and it depends on how you do it, how you approach it. And even the ones I really like, there's times where I'm kind of like, I don't know. But there's a boldness to that, and going out and meeting people where they are, going out into the streets, being willing to engage, in sometimes fraught territory, hostile territory. And that doesn't really make sense in a Catholic context. Excuse me, it's not really, I don't want to say it's not missionary, but I guess it's not evangelical in quite that way. A different approach, I guess. Have I ever seen a Catholic street preacher? I don't think so. So yeah, those are a few things. I like the agility and potential for boldness and potential to take a risk on somebody, to go out and to pray for somebody, to step out and meet people where they are. Less of a bar of entry. It can be less intimidating. Now it can become so diluted. Again, that can be the flip side. It becomes so diluted with the culture that you start to lose sacred space, that threshold of crossing into sacred space. It's kind of like they become so infiltrated by the world that it's like, are we really doing something that different here? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. What else did I want to say? Yeah, and again, being kind of unmoored from a deeper, and it's not quite that straightforward, because I was going to say being unmoored from a deeper historical lineage, there are dangers that attend to that. Like I said, idiosyncrasy, becoming too idiosyncratic, getting lost and kind of inwardly focused and going off in weird directions. There's a vulnerability to personality cults, to abuse, things like that. Though abuse, that's not unique to evangelicalism. And I was going to say, it's not that straightforward either, because a lot of these non-denominational churches link up with each other and they form kind of networks. And so there is often broader support. But man, that was a massive and significant change with huge downstream effects, the Protestant Reformation. I'm sure a lot of ink has been spilt on this topic. And I'm sure I don't know even the smallest percent of the conversation, but just thinking it through in my own mind here. Just the fragmentation, from the Holy Catholic Church. I know there was a schism with the Orthodox Church, 1000, 1000, what did you call that? The 11th century? Anyways, 1051, I can't remember the exact date. So there was already that schism. But those two churches, with some significant differences, I don't think are quite so far apart, but then that Protestant Reformation hits, and it's just like fragmentation into thousands and thousands of different directions, and you want to run the clock back on all that and say, I've heard people say this and it makes sense, like that was a big mistake on the Catholic Church's part, where it could have been, had there been more engagement and more compromise or more dialogue or more of something, that Lutherans were an order, could have been kept within the church if they had onboarded the criticisms and worked to, whatever, transform. That there could, Lutheran today, it could well have been in an alternate universe, that Lutheran was another order alongside the Dominicans, alongside Franciscans, alongside Jesuits, whatever, and the Catholic Church would still have been together. I don't know how much truth there is to that. I've also heard it said that Protestant Reformation was growing, springing up independently in various places, and so perhaps it was just an inevitability that even if they had made that effort, that splintering would have happened, that the forces of change, the historical forces, cultural forces, religious forces were just too overwhelming, that it was inevitable. Was it Zwingli and Calvin, and I don't know if there were other reformers, so... But anyways, I never really tied this point up, just a little addendum. The point I was trying to make about deliverance, and I guess the corollary, the equivalent in the Catholic Church would be something like exorcism. There are evangelical churches out there that would just love to be contacted and to have, to be delivered, or to have somebody to pray deliverance over you, or to cast out demons or whatever. Catholic Church, especially if you're not already a member, it just seems like not as clear cut. My sense is that again, you would have to go through the process first of becoming a member, and it would take a while to gain that access, to get that rite of exorcism, or be more steps. And in a way, I've heard people use the hospital analogy. In a way, it's like when you're sick and you need help right away. In a sense, another analogy, I use the speedboat and freighter analogy. Another analogy could be something like emergency room. A lot of these evangelical churches are more like emergency rooms that are just about around the clock. You could find something and someone to help you. And the Catholic Church would be more like having to schedule with your primary provider or something. I don't know. Hold all that lightly. Just a few thoughts, observations. Take care.